This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. History often remembers Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle as towering figures who stood against Nazi Germany during World War II. But what happens when we look beyond the legends? My guest today is award-winning historian Richard Vinen, whose remarkable new book, The Last Titans: How Churchill and de Gaulle Saved Their Nations and Transformed the World. It brings these two extraordinary leaders together in a fascinating dual biography for the very first time. Named one of the Times of London's best books of the year, The Last Titans explores not only the personalities and often turbulent relationship between Churchill and de Gaulle, but also how they guided Britain and France through war, empire decline, and the birth of the modern world. Through extensive original research, Richard Vinen offers fresh insight into two men whose influences continue to shape international politics today. Richard Vinen is professor of history at King's College London, winner of the prestigious Winston History Prize and one of Britain's leading historians of modern Europe. I'm happy to have Richard join me here on the Speaking of Writers podcast. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be with you.
It's great to have you. So what first inspired you to pair Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle in a single biography rather than writing about each separately?
Partly because they're very unusual figures in the sense that their lives are very closely intertwined. So de Gaulle is actually in London for a large part of the Second World War. They're living in the same city, even though they're leaders of their individual nations, and famous for that. Partly because they know each other so well and have such an interesting relationship of, I think, in the end, respect, but certainly not an entirely smooth relationship at times. And partly, I think, because they're almost the only two men you can really compare with each other. Not because they're similar, but because they're different. But they're men of kind of comparable stature. One often thinks of Churchill in Britain, of de Gaulle in France, as being incomparable men who are just different from everybody else. But when you put them alongside each other, you do think that in some way these are two men who kind of stand alongside each other in terms of the importance they have.
Why do these two men continue to fascinate readers more than 80 years after World War II?
I think partly just because they have such extraordinary lives, so that they're very unusual cases of politicians who'd be interesting, even if they had never held political power. So Churchill is famous at the age of 25, and he's famous partly because he comes from one of Britain's great political dynasties, but also because he's already made a reputation as a writer, as an adventurer, as a soldier at this very, very young age. This is 40 years before he becomes prime minister and before he even enters the British Parliament. Now, de Gaulle would certainly not be famous if he hadn't flown to London in 1940 and become the leader of the Free French, very obscure at that stage. But nonetheless, when you look back at his life, he's a kind of a thinker, a writer. Again, he's someone that if you came to him fresh, not knowing about any of his political role, you'd still think de Gaulle was worth studying, I think. So I think they're partly fascinating because of the kind of people they are, and then they're fascinating because they have this huge role during the Second World War, and especially in the case of de Gaulle, then a huge role as a civilian politician after the Second World War.
Richard, your title is The Last Titans. Why the last?
Well, I think in some ways it's hard to imagine people being produced who are going to have that kind of impact again. I think there are certain things about the 20th century that make political leadership become more kind of banal, more smooth, more manufactured. And in a way, these are the last, I mean, they're obviously born in the 19th century, each of them, and to some extent formed in the 19th century. And so they're, in a way, the last kind of figures of that kind of heroic period where an individual could act on their own and have a huge impact.
On paper, Churchill and de Gaulle seem like complete opposites. What surprised you most once you began comparing them?
All sorts of things. First of all, they're astonishing men, each of them in their own right. And even when you do a lot of archival research, historians always like to imagine we discover extraordinary things, in the archives that no one has known previously. And lots of the secrets about Churchill and de Gaulle are hiding in plain sight in their own published writings. And when you read them, you think, I can't believe this man said this. So that Churchill writes an autobiography of his early life, which he publishes in the early 1930s, in which he says he doesn't believe in God. And you think this is a conservative British politician. The British Conservative Party more or less exists to defend the Church of England. It's a completely weird thing for a man in that position to say. Um, and Charles de Gaulle, there's an extraordinary moment in his memoirs, a really kind of chilling moment, where he describes getting advice smuggled out of Germany just before the defeat of Germany in 1945 by a German who tells him France will have to make up with Germany if she wants to resist the power of the English and the Americans. And the German who gives them this advice is Heinrich Himmler. And the only person you could imagine who would admit to having received advice from one of the most evil men of modern times would be Charles de Gaulle. So in that case, both those things just sort of knocked me off my seat. But then there are other things, I suppose, that I found about their relationship. So particularly one of the things that struck me was that in a strange kind of way, uh, Churchill likes the French, perhaps not France. De Gaulle loves France, but Churchill is more kind of humanly affectionate towards the French as a people. And also, there are strange ways in which Churchill does understand France very well. He's kind of sympathetic to the French political system. There's a wonderful moment in 1940 when there seems a serious prospect that the British might come out in favour of the restoration of the French monarchy as a way of winning over right wingers in France, who at that stage were actually quite anti German to their cause. And the man who puts a stop to this is actually not de Gaulle, who's rather sympathetic to royalism in private, but Churchill, who says no, republicanism and the French Revolution are baked into the French kind of political identity.
Did their differences actually make each of them stronger leaders?
Yes, I think they did. So, first of all, they're each of them leaders for a particular place and a particular country. So Churchill is very much the man of 1940. And, there are terrible things about Churchill's career, his imperialism, his attitudes to race. He's a very unsuccessful post-war prime minister, really, in the early 1950s. He's unsuccessful in many of his political activities across the whole of his career. But I think at least as far as the British are concerned, and maybe as far as everybody is concerned, one forgives him everything for that kind of stand in 1940 when he really does represent British resistance at a time when resistance seemed a difficult and potentially very hazardous thing. So Churchill is very much a man of war and war of particular kind. Um, Churchill is also, in a strange kind of way, a team player. So Churchill is a member of the British ruling class, and he's always surrounded by people who understand him, who respect him, who to some extent he respects, and who can sometimes restrain him. De Gaulle, I think, is different in the sense that de Gaulle is a much more isolated figure, especially in 1940. De Gaulle is always more solitary. And so de Gaulle has the particular qualities of a man who has to take a much more lonely stand in 1940, of course, at a time when many in his country have accepted the defeat, um, and then who, after 1945, transforms his country. So Churchill, to a large extent, works with the grain of British history. Um, de Gaulle, I think, turns the tide of French history and changes France very dramatically after, well, particularly after he returns to power in 1958.
Their relationship often shifted between admiration and frustration, too. Was it ultimately a friendship, a rivalry, or something more complicated, Richard?
Um, I think they're probably not quite friends. They're not quite rivals because I think they're actually trying to do different things. I think, in a funny kind of way, Churchill perhaps thinks of himself more as being the rival of de Gaulle than de Gaulle thinks of himself as being the rival of Churchill. On the cover of my book, there's a photograph of them walking down the Champs-Élysées in 1944, November 1944. And de Gaulle is wearing the uniform he always wears, which is the uniform of a two-star general, a general de brigade. It's quite a junior rank, actually. And he never tries to change that rank. He always says, it's the rank I won on the battlefield. This is the rank I'll keep. Um, And Churchill is wearing the uniform of an honorary Air Commodore in the Royal Air Force. And no one can understand why he's wearing this uniform. And I think he's wearing it because it's the equivalent of a General de Brigade, of a two-star general. And I think at the end of the war, he suddenly thinks, actually, being equal to de Gaulle in rank is something worth having. So I think rivalry molds them in that way. But also, I think, even if they're not exactly friends, there is enormous respect between them. They really have the measure of each other. Churchill's most famous, most notorious remark about de Gaulle is he thinks he's Joan of Arc, but I can't get my bloody bishops to burn him. And that's a very typical witty Churchill remark. But you understand it better when you remember Churchill is a huge admirer of Joan of Arc. And when he says de Gaulle is Joan of Arc, he's not just mocking him, although he is partly mocking him. Above all, he's saying this is the great representative of France and things that France stands for, which Churchill hugely admires. And I think the affection you see in their very last ever meeting. So most of their meetings after the war are sad meetings because Churchill is increasingly old and frail. And de Gaulle, of course, when he comes back as head of state in France, is a huge figure. And he's kind of overshadows Churchill, and Churchill sometimes seems rather sad when they meet each other, a sad figure. Very, very old by this stage, of course. But they meet for the very last time in the autumn of 1960, actually in France, in the south of France, in the prefecture at Nice, where Churchill is on holiday and de Gaulle's in the area, and they meet up. And it's a kind of private meeting. It's not a meeting for journalists and photographers and so on in the way that their meeting 6 months earlier when de Gaulle had come on a state visit to London had been. Um, and that meeting seems like a very tender meeting. And Churchill's private secretary writes back saying, de Gaulle was affectionate and charming throughout the meeting. One doesn't always think of de Gaulle as being an affectionate and charming person, but I think he probably knows this is the last time he's going to see Churchill. And he does. Churchill means something to him.
Mm. Churchill is often remembered as the ultimate wartime leader. De Gaulle's greatest achievements arguably came after the war. How do their legacies differ?
So I think, I mean, in some ways, this is a very painful thing for an Englishman to say, but they both make great speeches on the 18th of June, 1940. So this is when de Gaulle calls on the French to resist, and it's when Churchill makes what I think is his most kind of resonant ever speech, the finest hour speech, which finishes with these words: "The British Empire and its Commonwealth shall last 1,000 years. People will still say this was their finest hour." And it's a wonderful speech and a wonderful speech to make under the circumstances. But it's also a double-edged and poignant speech because if 1940 was our finest hour, then everything since has been a disappointment. And I think there is a sense in which the British are haunted by the heroism of 1940 and by the sense that we're not quite that kind of country anymore. And it's very difficult for Britain to rebuild itself after the Second World War because it's very difficult to Britain to adjust to not being a great power anymore and to realizing that the world doesn't owe us a living. Britain has to make itself if it wants to survive. Whereas I think de Gaulle, in a funny kind of way, benefits from the French defeat of 1940. I think there's a sense now that France has to change and that France has to be different. And although de Gaulle is a great nostalgic, I think he recognizes that France needs to break with its past. There's a wonderful speech he makes in the early 1960s when he's getting France ready to abandon her real last vestige of empire, to move out of Algeria. And this is a huge moment because people have brought de Gaulle back to power in 1958, assuming that he will be the man who will keep Algeria. And he knows now, he realizes, no, Algeria has to go. And he makes this speech and he says, I'm a man of the 19th century. I was born in the age of the sweetness of the oil lamps and the fleet at sail. He kind of evokes the 19th century. And then suddenly the tone changes. He bangs the table and he says, but that's over. And nothing matters unless we build our politics on reality. And I think that really captures what de Gaulle does for France.
Yeah. Let's fast forward to today. How do you think Churchill would react to today's relationship between Europe and the United States?
Churchill would be heartbroken. So it mattered a lot to Churchill that there should be a relationship between the United States and especially Britain. Churchill, of course, has an American mother. Churchill is an honorary citizen of the United States at the end of his life. But I think Churchill also sees the United States as the kind of torchbearer of liberty throughout the world. And he does know there's a possibility that Britain will be defeated in the Second World War. And he does say if Britain is defeated, then it will be for America to pick up this role as the kind of defender of liberty. And so I think the sense that uh, maybe America doesn't want to play that role anymore, and perhaps this is inevitable. Countries change and countries rise and fall. I think that would be very, very sad for Churchill. I think de Gaulle would adjust to it much better. I mean, de Gaulle would say that Donald Trump is, a representative of his country defending his own country's interests in a ruthless way, and that's what leaders do. I think he wouldn't be shocked by it. So, in a strange kind of way, although de Gaulle, a hugely cultivated, cultured, old-fashioned European, doesn't sound like a man who's like Donald Trump. I think he would understand Donald Trump in a funny kind of way.
Mm. You draw from an extraordinary amount of archival material. Was there a particular letter, diary entry, or conversation that completely changed your understanding of these two leaders?
Um, I suppose partly the one I referred to when I realized that it was Churchill who headed off the restoration of the French monarchy in 1940. Um, there are all sorts of strange little discoveries in the archives, which I love. There's a moment when Desmond Morton, who's one of Churchill's advisors, writes to someone else about de Gaulle in, I think, 1941. And you can see at this stage the British ruling class have begun to understand that however exasperating they find de Gaulle, that he does represent France and that they're going to have to deal with him. And Mawson finishes the letter with these extraordinary words. He says, de Gaulle is not a bastard, de Gaulle is France. And I think that kind of sums up how intelligent British people come to understand de Gaulle.
Yeah. Which of the two, Richard, would have been the more interesting dinner guest for you?
Um, I mean, one is always remember that a dinner guest is a two-way street, and I would have been tongue-tied and intimidated in the presence of either of them.
Mhm.
So I don't suppose they would have found me a very entertaining dinner guest. Um, I just don't know. Churchill's obviously a vastly more gregarious, talkative, sociable, witty person. Well, they're both witty in their ways. De Gaulle, I think, would be a much more difficult dinner guest. On the other hand, if you can get de Gaulle to talk, you get gems of extraordinary kind of intelligence and insight from him. You'd certainly eat better at Churchill's than at de Gaulle. That's all I can say.
What do you hope readers are still thinking about long after they've turned the final page of The Last Titans?
Well, I suppose as a historian, I should say they should like all sorts of important, grave conclusions about geopolitics and so on and so forth. But actually, I think Macaulay, the 19th century British historian, says it best when he says, "My ambition is that my book should replace the latest fashionable novel on the bedside table of a young lady." And so, I suppose what I'd most like them to think is that these are two men whose lives could have come out of a novel. And I'd hope that my book reads in some ways like a novel and that it's simply dramatic and entertaining.
Richard Vinen's new book is The Last Titans: How Churchill and de Gaulle Saved Their Nations and Transformed the World. It's an engaging, deeply researched look at two remarkable leaders whose decisions shaped not only Britain and France, but the course of modern history. Richard, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much indeed. It was lovely talking to you. Thank you.
And thank you for watching and for listening to the Speaking of Writers podcast. Subscribe to it, like it, share it, follow it, and you can subscribe to it on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Steve Richards. Thank you again for watching and for listening. I'll talk to you next time.